I'm MD McCollum, and welcome to this Post Magazine exclusive tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to create a shot of a futuristic city with airspace traffic. The traffic will be animated in iClone over a city image rendered out of Studio Max. We'll then finish off the post work in After Effects with some very simple masking and fog effects. So let's get started. So let's set up our workspace. Here's our background image that we rendered out of Studio Max. We're just going to drag it into the iClone workspace. We're going to click on the Stage tab, and we're going to go over and turn on the HDR effect and the tone map, and just leave them at default. You should see an immediate change when you turn that tone map on. If not, come up here and check your shader, and make sure you're on pixel shading. Now I'm going to Control G to toggle on the grid. So I'm going to move the ground plane and use it to create my path on. Creating paths in iClone can be a little tricky, and this gives us something for it to stick to. So now I want to go to Animation, Create Path. I'm just going to draw a circular path. Just like that. Turn off our grid. And so we can see it a little easier, I'll change it to red. This is going to be the flight path for a group of fighters. So we're going to go ahead and load our fighter. And this fighter, by the way, came out of one of the Real Illusion science fiction packs. Now this is the beginning of our path, this is the end of our path. So we're going to take our fighter with it selected, we're going to use the Pick Path button, and we're going to put it on the first part of the path. And what we're going to do is tell it to follow the path on the -y axis. And then we're going to scale it down to 10%. Move our time scrubber all the way over to the last frame. Pick path again. Click the end path. Move our scale down to 0. Now we should have it flying along the path. And of course scaling down as it goes. Plus there's built-in perspective with iClone as well. Now I'm going to select the path, and I'm just going to move the path over a little so we can see more about what we're doing. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to clone this fighter. So I'm holding down the Control key. First thing I'm going to do is Control Q to toggle off the gizmo. You can use the gizmo or you can just use the mouse like this. I'm going to hold down the Control key and I'm going to move the mouse and it will clone a copy of the fighter. We'll move it up. I'm going to keep that fighter selected and I'm going to clone another copy. With that copy still picked, I'm going to attach it to the fighter that is actually on the pathway. And I'm going to grab the other fighter and I'm going to attach it to the fighter that's on the pathway. Now they should inherit the scaling, and now we're going to have 3 fighters moving around. Now select the path, choose Edit Path, and we're going to need to bank these. So what we're going to do is turn the arrows, bank the arrows towards the direction, just rotate them, the direction you want the craft to bank, and how much bank you want the craft to have. So now as you see, they'll bank, and that right there is probably a bit much. Say about like that, then that. And of course you can move your scrubber down as you bank them. Now the only problem we have left is it's a little bit slow. So we select our fighter and we click on the timeline to open it. And we click on the object related track to make sure that the fighter is what we're using. Here the fighter is actually called Body 01. And we're going to stretch out where we can see the entire timeline Go to the transform, and we're going to move this last key. We want it to go faster. Let's move it to about 500. Now we're also going to have to move the constraint from the path to 500. So this is how you'd edit your path and your speed. Now they'll move quite a bit faster. Let's select the path. Let's move it back. About right there where this endpoint will end up, where we know it will end up below this building. And now we're going to need to edit this path again and extend this point to where it's off screen. So we're going to click on that point. With the gizmo, we're just going to move it off screen. And they'll scale down to 0. And so that takes care of the first part of our traffic. We'll turn our path visibility off. And now we'll go back and start working on some of the cross traffic. Next, we'll add a low poly traffic group. And this group I created from a group of objects, some low poly spacecraft. Since they're used off in distance, it really doesn't matter as long as you can just see distinctive shapes. And then they're all attached to one of the objects. iClone does not have grouping, but it does have attaching and linking. Linking is more for animation to release something. Attaching is what you would use in most cases. If you had 10 ships, you would attach 9 of them to one of the ships. And that way you would have a group. And what this basically is a group of ships that I've just animated between 2 keyframes to move across the screen very slowly. Just going to position them. Now I'm going to hold down the control key and clone it, move it up, spin it around. A little more adjustment. And now we have traffic moving 2 ways. Now with one of these traffic groups selected, I'm going to hold down the control key again, clone it again by moving it down. And then we're going to spin it around, orient it. Move it down just a little. Maybe a little further back. I kind of want it to just disappear into those buildings in the background. Okay, now hold down control, drag it to copy again, rotate it back around the other direction. And now we have 4 lanes of traffic. Now we'll load a large transport cargo ship. We'll make a small fleet out of it. Go ahead and position it. I wanted this fleet to go in between these buildings. So, a little bit about right there. Then I'm going to hold down control, duplicate it, and just all I'm going to do is duplicate each of these, move them into a different spot. so that we have a fleet moving. Doesn't matter how you do yours. Now we want to grab each one of these transports, with the exception of one, and we're going to attach them all, just like we was talking about grouping before. We're going to attach them all to one transport, so that that is all we have to deal with. And now we're going to move all the way to the end of the timeline, and we're going to move these transports forward. And this is where we should be right now. We're starting to build up several different types of traffic. Now we're going to place one more large capital ship in the scene. Put it in place. Don't worry so much about textures and how it stands out. We'll take care of that here in a minute. We're just going to kind of have it where it's going to be behind that tower when we're finished. Okay, now let's go to the last frame and let's just move this one a little bit. We want it to kind of lumber along. So now we've got a little bit of movement in most parts of the screen. Now, in reality, you'd probably want to go ahead and add a lot more traffic to it and take a little more time to setting up the traffic. But this gives you a basic overview of just what we're going to animate. Now let's throw a few post effects on here within iClone. And this is something that's new to version 5. Now let's address some of the problems of the mixed assets. These models have sharp edges compared to the soft render in the background. Some of this will work on in iClone, some of this will work on in After Effects. So for right now, let's go to Stage, Effect, and let's double click and add a color filter. Click on the color filter and change this to 8, 15, and 20 to get a more blue effect overall. This dulls out some of the contrast. And now let's add a blur. And on the blur, let's try not to go over 15. Well, all we're trying to do is knock some of that sharpness out to where they look like they belong to each other. And so the last thing we want to do is come in with the color adjust. We need to knock some of this intensity down a little bit. And what we're going to do with it is change it to 10, 13 on the contrast, and 10 on the gray style. And this is what we end up with. We're already starting to take some of the sharpness out and make the assets look like they belong together in the same scene. Now we need to render out our assets for the composition. We're going to need a single image to plug some holes, and we're going to need the video. So we'll go ahead and do the image first, but we're going to use it for background, so we need all the props turned off. Make sure you're on the Export tab, Image, and match the resolution you're working in this case 720p. And I'm just exporting this out in BMP. You can export it in whatever your preference. Now we'll click the Video tab, turn on the props. Again, make sure that we're in 720p. And this is the 64-bit beta version, so it doesn't have all the formats available. It only has AVI. But you will have Windows Media version, Real Media, MP4, and some other formats available. In this case, we're going to go ahead and take AVI. We want to make sure we're on Final Render with Anti-Alias checked. And we're going to move down and export the entire sequence. uncompressed. Now, when we get finished with this, we'll be in After Effects. So I'm going to go ahead and let this render out, and then we'll jump over to After Effects. We're now in After Effects CS5, and I have imported the AVI and the BMP. Now, this is going to be a simple composition, so we're just going to use default comp 1. And let's go ahead and drop the AVI render into the default comp. Next, all we need to do is some simple masking. Go back to frame 1. And of course, you'll want to do this, zoom in and do this much closer and in much better detail. But just for this tutorial, we're just going to quickly mask. And we of course want this to be a subtraction mask. Same thing down here for the traffic. We want it to go behind that building. And also these ships are going to go across this building. So let's go ahead and mask it out. Again, I'm just doing this very quickly. You'd want to use the zoom tool and go in and do this more precise for an actual shot. This is just to give you an idea of what we're doing. And of course you can come in and immediately adjust that mask. And we want all these to be subtraction masks. And then this one we will zoom in on, make it a little easier to mask it. Okay, now we have our basic masking in place. Now we've got these holes that we've cut into the video, and this is where our background image is going to come into play. We're going to drop it down below the AVI render and fill those holes. So now we have the craft going behind the building. But we have one big problem here. Our fighters go behind it too, and that makes them look awfully large, and we want them to go in front of it. So what we're going to actually have to do there is come into the mask itself, locate that mask, which is mask 3, and let's cut its opacity to 0. Hit our stopwatch, and we'll go to where these craft are just past it. Then we'll pull our opacity back up to 100%, and now we can move this first keyframe right over next to it, because we want it to pass in front of that building, but we want these to pass behind it. So what that does is turn the mask on and off, basically, to allow that to happen. Now you might also want to come into each individual mask and feather it some. There's a lot of things you could do to make this better. This is just the basics of it. Now let's add a layer of fog to kind of tie into the fog that's already into the image render. So we'll go to Layer, New, Solid. Doesn't really matter what color. I'm naming mine Fog. Over in Effects and Presets, find Fractal Noise and drag it over. With that selected, Control Shift N to convert it to a mask. Then let's go into the mask properties. Let's feather it anywhere from 90 to 120 or 30. Feather the edges out. And let's drop our opacity. There's 66. Let's go on down to about 30, maybe a little less. Okay. Now, so it won't be static, let's move back over to frame 1 with our time scrubber. Let's click the stopwatch next to evolution. Let's move all the way to the last frame. Put in a factor of 2. And now, as you can see, we'll have the fog cycling. So let's go ahead and take a look. There's a lot of different ways to do fog. This was a technique I learned from a tutorial on the internet. There are several different ways to do fog. This is just a quick way to do it. And if you don't think that the fog is moving that much, then all you really have to do is pre-render it a little, move your time scrubber, and you'll see the fog moving. But in this case, I just want it to move very subtly anyway, because all we're trying to do is tie it into the background render. Try to make things where they're not quite as sharp when they're up against that render. And that's basically all there is to it.